Okay. So we were just talking about how you said that your new lows are like the old highs as far as the chess progress
Yeah,
is concerned, right? Yeah, that's a
I
really good
feel the
thing.
trend settling in.
Hmm. Yeah, that's nice. And the fluctuations about the mean are really normal. I think that you can always map it to either there's a chess thing that you are missing, or there's a life factor that you haven't removed from the equation. You know?
Yeah, sometimes that's like not enough water or sleep
Yeah.
happens.
There are some oddly specific things that people talk about sometimes, like when you get married, you lose like 400 elo points, something like that. I think that's mostly fake because depending on your life circumstances, it might be easier to maintain a certain level just because like you can devote more time or something, or your focus is better, and you really just have
Right.
to like get better at those things to balance out everything. You know?
Yeah, I mean, like, my husband and I are in the lucky situation where we're both, like, super nerd gamers.
Hmm.
So it's like, oh, you're in a dungeon. All right, I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, that is nice when people have that understanding. I know that some
Yeah.
people they're like constantly harassed by their family members. They're like, "Why are you playing that chess again? Don't you know we've got to go play dominoes?" Or like, just I just made up something, but like it could be
Mom, I
anything.
can't pause an online chess game.
Yeah, exactly. The quintessential "I can't pause, mom" situation. Um, yeah, and that also goes for training. Like having like continuous blocks of training every day is actually hard to accomplish with just a regular schedule. And that's one area where coaching can really help because not only do you like set aside time and establish a schedule, which are both good for anything you want to do, as you know, but it also means you can take shortcuts on getting certain kinds of knowledge. You don't have to figure it out yourself, which can be very time consuming. So for today, we're going to start on some endgame stuff. And, well, we've already done some endgames, right? But this is the first time where we're going to look at some theoretical endgames. So when I say theoretical endgame, I mean a situation that you might find in an endgame primer, something that's considered fundamental, that might be a building block for more complicated situations. Make
Okay,
sense?
great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first few that I picked, I chose these examples because they are extremely widely applicable. In fact, just by me pointing out a couple examples, it'll like automatically raise your level with these endgames. But then we're going to look at some where it demands some specific knowledge for that position. And the reason I think it's important for us to look at this at a relatively early stage in your chess development is, number one, we're kind of doing a speed run of like beginner to intermediate player, right? So
Yeah.
we can't hit everything. So we may as well hit some really important and widely applicable things on the way. I also think that when you learn a few of the theoretical endgames, it sets the stage for learning more theoretical endgames on your own. Because, first of all, you know they exist. Second of all, you understand how you can think about them. Like, why do we even bother studying these kinds of positions? And you'll know some of the most common ones. So let's start with some kind of easy stuff that's super useful all the time. Okay, so this is our first situation. And this isn't really like a puzzle that we need to solve right now, but you could think of it as black to play, because if it was white's move, it would be super easy to win. You could just take the rook for free. So let's just take this in for a second. So black has a material advantage, you agree?
Yes.
They do. Do you think it's enough for black to win the game?
Not necessarily, because the pawns can sort of like play this little seesaw game, and then if the correct one is forward relative to the rook, then the other one can capture it if the rook decides to take it.
Right, so one pawn can protect the other, but if the rook is always attacking one of the pawns, for example, let's say I just pick a random move that attacks a pawn, and, we step forward. What is our plan here as white if, black just passes the turn? Like, let's say that they just move their king or something to make a small improvement. What does white want to do?
F7?
Yeah, exactly. So this is a really important detail, that when you play f7, even though they can take the pawn, you just win this race to get a queen. And what do you think the result should be with queen against rook?
Queen wins every time.
Not every time. That's
Not
a very
every time?
very strong statement.
Okay.
But queen generally wins, and it's only really challenging to win with the queen against the rook when your opponent is experienced. So around the level where you're playing, queen will beat rook basically every time. But
Okay.
there are some exceptional cases where the rook will force a draw. The rook will basically never win. The only time when the rook should beat the queen is when you've done something where like you line up your king and your queen, and the rook checks and then takes the queen for free, and that's just a disaster, not even worth studying. By the way, the reason that we should study these theoretical endgames is because a lot of more involved positions reduce to the theoretical positions. So even though they're sort of technical and it might defy common sense to think that they're important, where you're like, this is never going to happen, why would I study this position? First of all, they do happen. I've gotten a lot of theoretical endgames in my tournament games, even though I haven't really played that many tournaments over compared to other people who have been playing for over a decade like me. So they do happen. And the other thing is, once you learn these theoretical positions, you actually learn techniques that you can apply in other situations. Now, beating rook with queen, I think, is not important for you at this point. You'll just stay in the game, don't blunder your queen, and your opponent will probably make a mistake. You know, just kind of run at them with your king, and probably you'll win. Anyway, so this, for now, is good enough. Or like, I get a queen, I win the game. So is there any way that black could have avoided the situation? In this situation?
Is rook a7 a possibility?
You tell me. What will happen after rook a7?
Yeah, then they go f7 and then it's no longer valid.
Yeah, it's the same problem.
Right.
A really important takeaway from this position is that no matter what, when the two pawns are advancing and about to promote, if they reach the 6th rank together, they win.
Right.
So this is something to kind of keep ingrained in your mind. 2 pawns in the 6th rank confers great winning chances for the side with pawns, which also might defy the common sense that like rook is better than pawns. Now, if the pawns are not on the 6th rank, it's not necessarily the case that you're going to win. In fact, it's very unlikely. You have to reach the 6th rank. Do you think you can figure out the reason just from like thinking about this?
Yeah, so if you're on 7, then you're already like there basically.
Yeah.
It's more or less already a queen.
Right. What about like 5th or 4th rank?
Then the rook has some room to wiggle around and then get in the way of one of them.
So you think you should stop the pawns by getting in front of them?
Not necessarily, because then the other one can still wiggle back and be in the right position to capture you back.
So you probably shouldn't try to block from the front. But if we here, I'll just add a chapter here real quick.
Okay.
And I'm gonna move them both back 1 row, and it's still black to play.
Okay.
All right, this is just for point of comparison.
Sure.
All right, you see the same thing I see, right? With the 2 pawns on the 5th.
Yep.
Okay. So if we do the same exact thing as before, where we attack 1 pawn, it has to go forward, right? It doesn't really make sense to do something else.
Yeah.
Now how should black?
Then you can just double attack by getting right here, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. So you would go here, double attack, you know, one of those basic tactical motifs that we've already looked at. And if white passes the turn, we take this pawn. And if they advance this pawn, we take it. And if they advance this pawn, the very important detail is that they are 1 move away. So what do we do now?
Go to f6.
Yeah, only move, but it's an obvious and good move. Enough to win the game, because you already know how to checkmate with a rook and a king. So this is very important, because if you are on the defending side, you know that this is good, this is not good, and if you have a rook, you get an idea of whether or not you can allow the pawns to advance together.
Okay.
Another thing to keep in mind that we're not going to look at right this second, that will actually be on your chess homework, is if there is 1 pawn, you can still fail to win the game with a rook if the king is able to support that pawn.
Right.
So these are some logical building blocks. If the king supports the pawns are stronger. There's a greater winning chance or even drawing chance with fewer pawns. And if your king is able to join the defense, it might not matter if they're even on the 7th rank, because your king can blockade those pawns permanently. So adding a king to the attack is good. Adding a king to the defense is good for the defending side. Just general takeaways here. You'll notice from this position, where you have to play Rook F6, that the rook is best placed behind the pawn. This is something that is generally the case. It is true in almost all situations that when you are choosing where to put your rook, it should be behind a pawn in the late stages of the game. That's if the pawns are mobile. You might remember from our opening lessons that I said you want to create open files for your rooks at some point, right? And that's an art in itself. You have to figure out which files to open for the rooks. And the reason for that is your rook isn't that happy to be behind a pawn that can't advance.
Right.
But at the end of the game, when you have a passed pawn, which is what we call pawns that have no opposing pawn in front of them anywhere along the path, you want to support those with rooks. And if you want to stop a passed pawn, you need the rook in front. I mean behind. Either way, defending or attacking, you want it behind the pawn. So let's see an example. This is a sort of theoretical example, but we're not going to treat it as something where we need to like analyze and find the solution. I just want it to be kind of ingrained in your mind that this position is interesting and it could happen in practice and that there's a certain way to think about it. So who has the advantage here?
I mean, on first glance, it looks kind of equal, but
There's definitely something different, though, for white and black, right?
right. So one of the pawns is advanced a little bit farther for white, and I guess white is also... No, they're not. There's everything else is in the same sort of...
There's an important detail that you skipped over. You said white has a more advanced pawn. There's also something... Interesting.
There is also an extra pawn.
Yes, that's the most important factor. Now, in rook and pawn endgames, in particular, material doesn't matter that much.
Right.
And this is actually a good example of that. We'll see. In other kinds of endgames, material usually does matter. We'll see some examples on the endgame homework where opposite colored bishops, the material doesn't really matter. In positions where material doesn't matter, it's because control of key squares and attacking is important still. But usually, an extra pawn is enough to win the game. Almost any king and pawn endgame puzzle that you get, if you have an extra pawn, you should be able to win. You at least can't be worse, generally.
Okay.
So, even if it does turn out that it's a draw, I would still say that white is better. It's the better side of equality. Anyway, in this situation, things are very similar, but white has only one extra pawn. There's some terminology that you should know. This pawn on the A file, first of all, it's a pass pawn. How do you know, if you look at this position, that it's a pass pawn?
There are no other pawns in front of it?
Right.
On the opposing side?
Now, what if I put a pawn right here on this green highlighted square? Would it still be a pass pawn or no?
No?
No, that's correct.
Okay.
Your reasoning is?
Because if it advances one square, then it can still be attacked by this pawn.
Exactly. A pass pawn usually... It could be obstructed by pieces like the rook, but as long as there aren't any pawns downwind, you know, they're going to be not on the left, not on the right, not in front of it, then it's sort of like really threatening when that pawn begins to advance, and that's why we have a special name for the pass pawn. There's another name for this particular kind of pass pawn. It's called an outside pass pawn. The reason it's called outside pass pawn is that the majority of the pieces and the kings are on the other side of the board, and this pawn is outside. It's far from the action.
Okay.
What do you think the value is of an outside pass pawn? Is it better or worse than, you know, a different pass pawn?
If it's away from all the other stuff, it's probably higher, because then there's less that can interfere with it getting up to... Yeah.
A general takeaway about endgames, it doesn't really matter which ones. Usually the king has to defend the weaknesses. And you can consider the path of a pass pawn to be like one big weakness for your side, because if you don't control those squares consistently, you're probably going to lose the game by promotion, right? The queen will arrive and then everything's over. So white's goal in positions like this is pretty much always to either promote or get rid of that pawn for some other massive advantage, like winning all the pawns on the king side, for example. So these are some valid goals for white. And since it's so far away, it's really hard for black to satisfy all of the conditions to survive. They can't both go get the pawn and defend their king side. So outside pass pawns are really, really strong. The only thing that's maybe better than that is like connected outside pass pawns. they're called connected when they're next to each other, like in this diagram.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right, good. So this case, this is probably the best possible situation within reason for white. The reason is that the rook is behind the passed pawn. The nice thing about having a rook behind a passed pawn is that every time it advances, the rook gains scope and continues to support it as it advances. If your rook was in front of the pawn, what do you think would eventually happen? There's a problem with it.
Then even if you promote, the rook can still take it.
Well, if your rook is in front of the pawn, are you really going to promote?
Yeah. I thought you meant like the other side's.
Oh, the other side's rook?
Like behind somehow.
Yeah, I get that. Okay. So the real problem is that if your rook is in front, you have to eventually move it to allow the promotion, and that moment of weakness can be difficult. That doesn't mean that it's like the end of the world if your rook is in front of the pawn. Excuse me. But it's definitely not favorable in the grand scheme of things. If we're just taking a 30,000 foot view of chess in general, then most of the endgames where you are winning are going to have the rook supporting the pawn from behind.
Okay.
You can also win with the rook in front sometimes, but not always. And what do you think about rook on the side of the pawn? How does that compare to rook in front and rook behind? Just intuitively.
I'd say it's not as strong because if the rook is diagonal to the pawn, then
When I say on the side, I mean like protecting the pawn still.
oh. Okay.
So this is behind, this
Right.
is in front, and this. Hold on, I need more colors. And this is to the side, in blue.
Sure.
If you had to
I
rank
guess
them in order of like how good they are, what would your order be?
Probably behind. Then I'm not sure whether side or front is better, but I guess front's better until you get to the end, and then it's no longer better.
Yeah, that's probably a fair way to describe it. There is a situation where on the side is good. And that situation is when your king has to get in front of the pawn to support it. Because if you want to move your rook out from in front of the pawn in order to promote it, but on that move it gets taken, you'd want your king right there to support it, right?
Right, okay.
So sometimes it's good to be able to step in front with the king, because then your king is supporting the pawn, you can jump out at the right time, maneuver your rook a little bit better. So these are your different situations. Rook behind pawn, almost always really great. Rook in front of pawn can be tricky. You might want to bring your king in front of the pawn to fix that problem. And then the third case, rook next to the pawn, that's probably pretty good sometimes, but it doesn't help you to advance the pawn. The nice thing about rook on the side is then it's easy to bring your king in front. That's pretty much it. Okay, so this is a very simple view of this small advantage in a rook and pawn endgame. In this particular case, white is winning. I don't think it's important to get into how, because it's technically difficult. For instance, if black defends really well, white might need to sacrifice all of their kingside pawns in order to promote the queenside pawn, or vice versa. They might need to give up that passed pawn to win all the kingside pawns. And knowing how to do that and when is not simple. The big takeaway here, rook behind pawn, good.
Okay.
When attacking. Now here's a very similar situation. Who do you think is... Do you think that black is winning here or drawing? And why? If you just had to make an educated guess.
Well, the pawn structure on black side is going to take 2 moves to fix if you want to have the same, like...
The same exact thing as before? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that their pawn structure is bad on the king side, though?
Not necessarily, since... Well, there's one that's hanging, but that's that's better.
With this kind of reduced material, it's unlikely that it's going to matter. Because white will need to both attack that pawn and do something else useful for it to really hurt. You know, like, let's say they attack the pawn in one move, like rook c7. Boo-hoo, we'll just move our king and protect it. No big deal. I would rather move the king than the pawn, because the pawn move is forever, and the king move is more flexible. Okay.
But otherwise, like, based on what you just said about having past pawns on the outside, black looks like it's about to do pretty well here. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I would expect white to have to move the rook directly in front of that pawn in order to make things a little more equal.
You mean behind, right? Did you have the board flipped in your mind?
Is it behind? I can't tell.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I will only say that it's behind if the pawn's moving this way. Right, so these would all be behind if you're going that way.
Oh, yeah, it was flipped.
Yeah, gotcha. So it's really easy with positions that don't have a lot of pieces on to get super confused and turned around. I remember I had one rook and pawn endgame that I played in like trying to remember what year it was. It must have been 2016, and it was the last round of Washington International. And if I beat the leader in that game, I would win the tournament. I only was able to draw, and it was a rook versus pawn situation. But I remember when I was writing down my moves at the end of the game, I switched from writing the notation the right way to the board rotated completely in the middle.
Oh no.
Yeah, so I started like writing down the pawn moving. It was like I think it was the A pawn, so it was like A4, A5, and then it was like H3, H2. Like I just completely switched it, and it was kind of dumb, but that's easy to do.
Yeah.
The sanity check here is if white's pawns were going down the board, they would promote right now. So,
Yeah.
and same for black, and then it would be a different kind of huge mess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, we have the situation where black is definitely somewhat better, right, because of this outside pass pawn. And I think you said you wanted white to get behind the pawn with the rook, right? Do you think black can win after a move like this?
If they play properly, yes, but
It's quite
otherwise,
difficult,
I
it
don't
turns out. This game ended in a draw. This example, I took it from a world championship. I think it was Alekhine versus Capablanca from the early 1900s. And, you know, these are two world champion players, and white was not able to... I mean, white was able to draw, black was not able to win. So, rook behind pawn is also really important for the defense. That's the general takeaway here, even if you don't know exactly how you would continue. I think at this point, the details are not critical.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see a theoretical example that is also from practical play. You could think of this as a theoretical example because the position's very reduced. There's not a lot of material here, and it's conceivable that you could trade into this position from something more complicated. You know, it's kind of simple in terms of how many pieces are left. This particular game is Lasker versus Rubinstein. This is a pretty old game, and I guess it's worth mentioning that as people get better and better at chess, more and more positions become theoretical.
Oh, okay. Because then they're no longer encountered, I guess.
No, they become more and more theoretical. So they're encountered more and more often, rather than the opposite.
Oh, okay. I see.
And they become more and more important because as people get better and better at chess overall as a population, then what can distinguish you as a good player becomes more and more intricate and involved. And for that reason, I like to use games from like the 1800s to the mid 1900s for instructing people who are just learning how to play. Because those things that used to be cutting edge like 100 years ago are now like fundamentals for modern chess. And so you can really... One thing that was really common in the 1900s is one person would get an idea, the other person would have no idea what their idea is, that person would beat them with the idea. And now the game becomes a great idea, a great model game for that idea.
Yeah, I've heard of like people making moves that the engine didn't calculate, but then it realizes it was actually better.
Yeah, that does happen quite often. You're probably aware that the engine could also be subjectively strong based on your hardware and how long you let it run and things like that. So sometimes people have analyzed really deeply and with engines, but they've done it much more thoroughly than someone just like flicking on the engine while they're watching the game, that kind of thing. Hey, don't play them. Spoilers. All right, it's okay. We'll get into it.
Scrolled by accident.
Yeah, no scroll. Anyway, Yeah, so that also happens even not on purpose. Like a GM or somebody, maybe even not a GM, could play a move that's extremely good, and the computer doesn't recognize it right away because their algorithms are very limited. Chess is a hard game, even for computers. They're just faster and bigger and don't have to take care of themselves. So, like, the computers do better. Anyway, so this situation I chose to share with you because it's a good practical illustration of the rook behind pawn attacking concept. White is winning here, even though material is equal. They don't even have an extra pawn, just because their rook is better placed than the opponent's rook. So let's see if you can guess White's moves. Guessing the move is a really good learning technique if you have like a game collection. You know, you just see if you can emulate the play of the next person. So anyway, Black played Rook F6. This move is typical and good in situations like this, because as the pawn advances further down the board, your chances of losing the game immediately are increasing. Imagine the pawn is on F7. If you move the rook, you lose. Right? So we want to try to stall that pawn from advancing further and improve our pieces as black. So this is logical. It's not stupid at all. And what do you think White should do to try to improve their position?
Either advance the pawn from b2 to b3, or I guess I was thinking about moving the king, but I don't know where. So I know that e4 is illegal.
Yeah.
E4 is also illegal. Everything in front of the king is illegal.
Right.
But
do you think it makes sense to try to move horizontally or backwards?
Probably just horizontally then.
Yeah, you could maybe move horizontally. But does that improve your position?
No.
No, not really.
Not unless I go e3 maybe, but then I'm leaving the pawn on b5 unattended, sort of.
On b5?
Yeah, like the black pawn on b5 is unattended by...
Oh, you mean like you'd want to keep the chance to go over and get that pawn maybe?
Right.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. So if you play king e3, maybe you're abandoning your chances on the queen side. One thing that I think is a good habit is to ask yourself always, what will my opponent play after my move? Just to keep yourself alert to danger. So if you play king e3, what might they do to try to improve their position?
Probably b4.
Yeah, b4 is pretty reasonable. I would rather play something more attacking than b4. What?
Yeah, okay. So d4 and then I'm in check.
Maybe so. After d4 check, here I'll play it out just so that everybody can see when they watch this later. So if we play this move, right? Let me just make a comment here. All right, and then we play d4. I think that this is actually helping you with your strategy, isn't it? Maybe.
Ah, yeah, okay. Yeah, because then I can just...
Again, chess is hard.
Okay. I want to go up to e4 so that I can eventually be attacking the rook from a diagonal.
Right.
Because the rook can't move anyway.
Yeah. There's another nice thing about this. So, let's say that, you know, they stop king e5 somehow. Like, for example, with... well, I was going to say king d6, but then you could just take the pawn on d4. Maybe we just talk about it a little bit generally. So another nice thing about playing king e4 is that it frees the rook to improve itself. In this case, they don't really have any way to stop king e5, so you may as well, right? But, you know, maybe they start doing something threatening. Maybe they do something like king c4, and their idea is either to play d3 or to play king b3 and win this pawn on b2 and start their own attack. You could either play king e5 and chase the rook, or you could move your own rook. You know,
I could go to, what is this, d1, and then just replace the pawn in between the two kings.
Replace the pawn? What do you mean? Oh, like just capture it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, you could do something like that. We've got options. Another thing you could do is like come over here and try to chase the rook away with your rook because the pawn is supporting it. Or you could attack the king and then you know we have lots of options here. I think rook d1 is pretty reasonable. So d4, it looks like it just gives white a wealth of options after king e4. So probably they wouldn't do that.
Okay.
How about a move like king c4? How would you continue after a move like this?
Okay, well I can't move my own rook from its position because it's not... It's still supporting the pawn and it needs to stay there. But
that's not strictly true. You actually have options for where you can support the pawn, don't you?
That's true. I could also take the king to f4 and then I'll be supporting it from behind.
So if we try a move like king f4, you're going for these similar ideas to attack and chase the rook, right?
Right.
So if I were black, I would probably do something to try to keep myself in the game, having some chance to survive. So what would that be? Maybe I would play d4 now, because now the pawn's not hanging because your king's not on e4. Would you still play like king e5?
No, I'd probably start attacking the king with the rook then.
Like rook c1?
Yeah, c1 probably.
Okay. This is a little bit dangerous, because now when I play a move like king d3, this is sort of close to... Do you remember from the king and pawn, like king and pawn versus king, how usually you want your king on a couple key squares to support the pawn? That's also true here. So where do you think black wants their king to be?
Either to the side of, or... Does the king want to be behind the pawn? Or...
Well, think about the king and one pawn versus king situation. I think I asked you to check out some examples like that, and we talked about it a little bit too, right?
Right, like you talked about this like red carpet situation where the king is on either 2 or 7 rank, and then the pawn just gets yeeted forward.
Right. So if this d pawn is yeeting to d1, then where do we want the black king?
Okay. So then it would be convenient for black king to go to e2?
Right.
Yeah.
So this move rook c1 is actually provoking black to put their king where they want it. So this entails a little bit of risk. I think I would choose something more aggressive. Like, just because this is check doesn't mean it's actually helping. I think king e5 would probably make the most sense here.
Okay.
Your same plan is still pretty good. But it's not without risk, because, like, arguably they're going to get counterplay with this pawn coming in on the d file. Or maybe they'll win this pawn and bring the b pawn. So it's all kind of risky. So if we come back here, king e3, you didn't seem that convinced about it in the first place. You're like, yeah, I'll just make a move, why not? And we were just analyzing the consequences. And it looks like the consequence of king e3 is that maybe black can improve their king position. So do you think that there's any way that white could prevent black's ideas while still having all the same ideas from the first position?
I'm just taking a look and trying to mentally like draw lines around the danger squares with the king, and most of the options seem pretty slow, but
if you have a big advantage, you can often take your time. But you're right, you don't want to do nothing on any move. What was black's counterplay idea again in the variation we just looked at?
So if black king were in check, then from the rook on c1, then the black king would try and escape towards e2.
Yeah, and they also have the idea to go to b3 and b2. So all these ideas have something in common, right? There's one common origin for all this counterplay. It was one move that black played in that variation.
King c4?
Exactly. So if their counterplay comes from the move king c4...
Oh, okay.
How do we
then
stop
you
it?
want to try and prevent that?
Right.
By taking the b2 pawn up to b3?
Okay, so let's look at b3. b3 stops king c4. Does it have any downside?
I can't think of any right now, but I'm also very tired.
Yeah, that's okay. I understand that. These are also much more difficult examples than what we've worked on so far. Mostly like for show and tell, you know, like Once you get the intuition from these positions, you can apply them with less precision later on. So if we play b3, the downside is that usually it's going to be helpful to keep the flexibility to play a pawn move later. This is another general endgame wisdom type thing. If you have a pawn on the second rank, it's actually very useful quite often that you could either play 1 or 2 moves. So if you waste it earlier, you lose that chance when it matters. In this position, you can actually prevent all of their king moves in one move without sacrificing your ability to move a pawn.
Sure, so just take the opposition.
With king c3?
Yeah.
Okay, let's check this one out. If we play king c3, then let's say I play a move like b4, trying to take the opposition back.
Yeah.
What do you do?
I can still move king to b3 so that I'm no longer in check, and he still can't really do anything. Besides, well, he could still improve the pawn to d4.
Yeah, this actually looks pretty dangerous.
Yeah.
On my next move, I want to play d3, and you'll notice that the pawns are building a wall together, so your king can't come back.
Okay.
Let's say I played the move d3. What do you think black would do to support the pawn with the king after that?
Would he just stay where he is, or?
Nope.
Okay.
Material
so
doesn't necessarily
after,
matter. Yeah. So,
after these 2 moves have taken place and they've built a wall, or?
Yeah. So we're saying that maybe d3 has already been played and they want to try to improve their position. This is probably difficult because it's like the king is doing a good job protecting these pawns.
Yeah.
And they could probably just like shuffle back and forth if they wanted to.
Okay, but then would the king also go to protect the pawn at d3 by going to d4?
Yeah, this could be a thing. So let's say that they just pass the turn. We play d3, locking out the king. They play a move like rook f3, king d4. This is kind of dangerous, even though they might be able to win this pawn on b4. This is a source of counterplay, and you would have to calculate to see if white is actually better here. And there's some risk of failure there.
Okay.
So even though these might be legitimate answers, I'm trying to steer you towards one where you don't have to actually see anything at all. It's just a generally good move, and there's no real challenge. So not king c3. The reason that taking the opposition doesn't make that much sense here, there's 2 things. First of all, opposition helps when it requires them that they give up control of key squares. But here, since they have multiple pieces to move, you're not just getting the opposition easily.
Okay.
They don't have to move the king. The second reason is that when you go further down the line, for example, into this position, even if black doesn't play d3, even if they play something kind of not ambitious at all, then you really would wish that your king is over here. Sorry, like here.
Yeah.
The generalization that I would make is that you would like to play where you have strength, and you don't have strength on b3. Like, there's no reason to think that you're going to win the game by taking the b pawn necessarily.
Okay.
You would rather win the game by chasing the rook away and promoting your f pawn, because that's what's strong for you.
Okay.
Okay, so if we come back, there's one more move to think of. It's something that prevents all of their king moves from advancing, makes their pawn moves also unappealing.
Okay.
And it comes at no loss to you. Your king stays in a good spot, your pawn stays in a good spot.
So is that rook f4?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So let's take this move in, because this is something that is general. I think your intuition would be improving if you incorporate this into your database of things in your mind that are good in the endgame. We are cutting off the king, so the king cannot advance. You don't even have to think about the consequences of them advancing, because they can't do it. It sacrifices nothing for your strength on the king side, right? You still have the pawn supported. There's no tactical problem with that. And meanwhile, black has very few useful moves. The thought process that we just went through is called prophylactic thinking. You probably already know prophylaxis from like brushing your teeth, right? That's prophylaxis against periodontal disease. And in chess, prophylaxis is even more important because you could have a great idea for yourself, but if it allows your opponent to use their great idea, then it's all kind of just for nothing. So by thinking about what black wants and preventing it, it's just as good as making a very strong move on your own.
Okay.
Now, they can't advance their king, and they can't move their rook. Do you know why? So what would happen after, like, I don't know, rook f8? Let's just pretend. I can play it on the board just to illustrate.
The pawn just keeps going forward then?
Yeah, exactly. And they're going to have to backpedal severely to avoid a disaster. Let's say they do it. Let's just see how we finish it off. Let's say they come back and they want to go win the pawn. How would you play this as white?
I'm tempted to continue advancing the pawn, but...
When you advance the pawn, does it threaten anything?
No.
Alright, it's usually better to make a move with a threat if you can.
Right. So then I would probably go for either d4 or c3 in order to try and grab these two pawns that the king's leaving alone.
Oh, you mean like king d4 or king c3?
Yeah.
Okay. So which of those looks more appealing to you?
I think I like moving forward more than moving horizontally for now, although it seems more likely that I'll be able to take the pawn that's on b5, so maybe moving to the side is better in this case.
Well, if you play king d4, it's kind of like chasing two birds in a bush with one stone, because you can you can take the d pawn if they leave it, and you're also heading for the b pawn.
Yeah, true.
So this one is much better. There's another thing that's good about this. This is actually a prophylactic move, because if you play king c3, this gives them an extra option that might be useful to them. What do you think black should do to pose the most threat?
Would it be king e5?
Yeah, I think so. They might even have a better move than this, but this is at least an option where it looks like it might be useful for black, and we don't necessarily want to allow it. They're winning the f pawn with tempo. We have to move the rook, because if they can take the rook, we're just totally lost. So the play might go like this. If you, and then we'll have to see the consequences. For example, maybe take. Try to go get this pawn, but they can protect it.
Yeah.
Try to go get that pawn, but then it allows them to push their d pawn. Looks very, very dangerous.
Okay.
So that's interesting, how there's a difference between the two. This move is more common sense, just because it prevents their ideas and it advances your ideas. Now they can only win the pawn like this. And if they don't try to win the pawn, then you're just going to keep improving your position. So, how do we continue from here?
Would I go king c5 so that I'm looking at both the pawns?
That looks pretty reasonable. I think you have tons of good moves here. This is probably just one of many. A move that appeals to me in this position is like b4, fixing that weakness and advancing our pawn, or even f7, because we know that they want to take the pawn. So, but in this case, if they take it, it's a big disaster. And now what do we do?
Oh, just immediately grab d5.
Right, and this is good because that prevents them from ever getting counterplay against us by playing d4. Right, we just take it off, and we're still going to get that pawn.
Right.
Nice. Now, just as a quick review, let's say that we play this position now. Is this a win or a draw? And how do you know?
Okay, so
this is a little different from things we've looked at, so we're trying to apply some
I
concepts.
need to think several moves into this because there are only so many that.
You don't actually need to calculate here.
Okay.
Do you remember offhand just some of the positions that we looked at with a single pawn, the ones that were winning and the ones that were drawing? The winning cases have some common traits. Do you remember what's a better position for the king relative to the pawn?
Just to the side on rank 7 if that's...
Yeah, that's very specific.
At that point, yeah.
What about more generally?
Uh,
How about like in front versus to the side versus behind? What's the best position for the king? If the king on the 7th next to the pawn is the best,
yeah.
then could
Then
it
it's
possibly
fine
be
on the
bad?
side.
Yeah, it's good on the side, but you also need to have control of the full path when you're on the side.
Right, okay.
So what if
then
you're
is
just
it
in
better
front?
to be- Yeah, so front should be clearing a path for the pawn.
Yeah, if you're standing directly in front, you're going to be clearing the path for the pawn because you're eventually going to get control to, like, for example, in this case, a7 or c7. If your king is on the side of the pawn, you are probably going to get a draw if they can block your pawn.
Okay.
The exception is on the 6th rank. If the king is behind the pawn, that's the worst because you want to be able to break through to that good position that you mentioned, but you can't do that from behind if they're blockading the pawn. But even if the king is in front of the pawn, there are situations that aren't so good. So what do you think is better, king farther in front of the pawn or king right in front of the pawn? Just calibrating your intuition here.
Yeah. I want to say right in front because the king has this, like, one square zone of protection around it.
Yeah, that would be good because it would keep the pawn safe, but then you're less flexible because your pawn can't move. So there are situations where if they can get the opposition, it's a draw. So actually having the pawn farther behind the king is more flexible. That's kind of like what I was saying earlier, where if we keep the pawn back, then we have more options later on. For example, here, let's say we play b4, and they block. Now things become difficult because whenever we go to the side of the pawn, they follow us, keeping the opposition. And if we advance it, then it eventually becomes stalemate. So we actually want to avoid playing a move like b4 in this case. And we would rather either take more ground with our king or play a move like b3.
Okay.
The point is that after king b7 and we play b4, it's black's turn, not white's turn. So this is all king and pawn endgame stuff that we already saw. And it takes a lot of iterations to remember and understand it.
Okay.
Especially in unfamiliar situations.
Sure.
So here, the reason that it's winning is that we gain access to these really good squares.
Okay.
So, just as a mnemonic device, king like 2 squares in front or more is always winning. Even if their king is in the best defending spot. Alright, so that was all just a little trajectory. I mean a tangential trajectory. But it's very important because even though this is a theoretical rook endgame, it also has pawn endgames hidden inside of it. It's like a nesting doll of endgames where, like, the most simple basic ones with just one pawn are hidden inside of ones that have rooks and so on. Okay, so f7 is a move I like. King c5 is probably, like, easily winning too for the same reason. Like, if they just take this, I just like forcing them to take the pawn. This is winning though. Okay, so all that is very good, and that's to illustrate what happens if they play a rook move in that situation. In the game, they played b4, and this is understandable because we saw that in some situations where they played d4, we want to play king e4 and king e5, and that we're winning. This position is like a better version of the other variations we looked at because they're a move behind. In the other positions where we just, straight away tried to bring our king in, they actually already have their king on c4. So comparing the two is a useful thinking tool. Anyway, so b4 is what they chose. So let's try to guess white's move again. How are we going to run them out of good moves, thwart all of their ideas, and then advance?
Okay, well... Should I be leaving room for the b2 pawn in this case, or does it make sense to start yeeting the king around to try and capture something.
Well, what's the maneuver that you ultimately want to do? It was the first thing that you thought of in this example. You want to bring your king to...
E4? No, that's illegal. E3.
No, not in one move. Like, you had a square that you were aiming for in the variation where you played king E4.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm trying to get to king E5.
Yeah,
or
that's right.
G5.
That's your area of strength, right? Because we want to advance this f-pawn. So, we want to eventually break through like that. So if we kind of like futz around trying to win the b-pawn, for example, that might just give them time to, for example, improve their d-pawn and their king.
Alright, okay.
So if we can just shut them down so they don't get anything, there's nothing they can do, and then we can get king d4 and king e5, that would be really great. So I guess you implied a second ago that you were thinking about playing b3.
Yeah.
Just to block that side of the board. Let's take that idea and run with it. So let's say we play b3, and black has to make a move. They can't move the rook, right? So this takes on kind of like a king and pawn endgame quality, where they're restricted entirely to king and pawn moves.
Okay, so now they can't move their... I mean, they can legally move the pawn to d4. Like, they're the one on d5 to d4.
Right.
But...
What's the downside of that?
It's stuck, and it doesn't really accomplish anything for them.
Would you rather take it or do something else?
I don't think I can take it, though.
Well, with the rook. You can take it with the rook.
Oh, yeah, true. No.
Why not?
Leave it there.
What's wrong with taking it?
Then my passed pawn is gone.
Exactly, right. That pawn is better than the other pawn. So we don't want to trade these pawns. Good.
Yeah.
So if they play d4, it actually allows you to execute your plan, doesn't it?
Ah, yeah, it does. Because then black, by default, has to pass the turn. Somehow.
Mm-hmm. So let's play out a couple moves then. So we played b3. They played d4. And what's our winning move here as white?
Oh, king e4?
Right, yeah, it's the same thing. They can stop you from playing king e5, but it comes at a price. What's the best move for white here?
King takes d4?
Yeah, we're getting everything for free. In the other variations, we had to work to get the d pawn, or we had to work to go get the b pawn. But just by running black out of their ideas, because they're worse off, because we have this really good f pawn, we're able to just take all the pawns, no complications.
Huh. Okay.
Just by stopping their ideas. So d4 is losing on the spot, and for that reason, b3 is a really interesting move. The only other things to consider are the king moves. So let's say that they play something like king b5, just for sake of argument. What are you gonna do here?
Then I'll probably just go to king d4.
Yeah. We're not picky, right? Because once you get the king in, let's say they protect their pawn, you always get that same winning idea.
Okay.
The same strategic plan is succeeding everywhere. Okay, so for that reason in the game, so b3 was played. It's a very good move. You could probably also win with a rook move. Like, I bet you could play something like Rook F2 without really suffering at all. Because now they're in a similar situation where they can't move the king because you'll play king d4. They can't move the rook because you'll play f6. They'll probably play b3. And now you could, just keep waiting until they have no more moves left. You could even just go back and everything they do is bad.
Yeah.
Like if they play d4, now we play king e4. If they play king d5, we play king d4. It's just the same. They run out of moves.
Okay.
So you have multiple wins here, but I like b3. So they played rook f7, and I think this move should be a no-brainer. We finally made them move the rook.
f6.
Right, so we just keep going. They have to play king d6. This move, now that we've analyzed everything else, should be easy too.
Yeah. Then, king d4?
Yep. Now they're going to win the pawn, but we probably don't care, right?
No.
What should we do?
King C5.
King c5 is probably winning. It wasn't the game. It wasn't the move played in the game. It's definitely winning if they play rook takes f6 because we've already seen this position more or less, right? The pawns are on different squares, but we already know like this is very nice. Actually, this is a good situation to do a little review. Let's say they go here. How should white play from here?
King C5.
Okay, maybe I'll go here.
Yeah. King takes B4.
I'm gonna try to get as close to the pawn as I can. And now?
Okay. Okay. So should I just go King C4 maybe?
King c4 is opposition, but think about those pawn endgames that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
If you play King c4, where does black really want their king to be?
In front of the pawn. So maybe I'll take King A5 instead.
Yeah, King a5 is better. If you play the move King c4 and King b6, you can already stop your calculation right here because we know that king next to pawn with the blockaded pawn is a draw, except in like very limited cases at the very end of the board. So this is the best move, and this also makes sense because we're aiming for the squares in front of the pawn, right? If we can put our king on b5 or b6 or a7, those are all really good positions. They probably have to go here, and again, this is that position that we saw earlier as something to remember. The king is 2 squares in front of the pawn. That's winning. It doesn't matter whose move it is.
Okay.
Yeah, these are the simple, easy takeaways. Okay, so we could win with King c5 if they take the pawn right away, and I'm at a loss for what useful move they can play besides Rook f6. So this should be a win. Lasker, who was playing white in this game, chose Rook f2, which is perfectly fine and good. No problem with that. King d6. And here he played something that was needlessly nice. Something, a little spectacular. The whole time we've been saying the rook has to stay behind the pawn to support it.
Yeah.
But for tactical reasons, there's actually a moment here where white can improve the rook and move it out from behind the pawn. So what's the only move that white could play with the rook that is not behind its pawn? It's a funny question. Like, you might not normally think to look for it, but it's a good exercise.
Would it just be e2?
Well, then they'll take the pawn on f6.
Oh yeah.
So we want to find a move where if they take on f6, we win. A little bit of a convoluted way of thinking, but it's definitely a useful thought process because sometimes we know for sure what our opponent wants to play, and we can set traps for them.
But it's not behind the pawn, so it can't be f5?
Right, it's not behind the pawn.
Okay.
Rook f5 is winning. Like almost every move is winning.
Yeah.
But you would have to return to the position you just had more or less, and then play King c5. So we're looking for something distinct. It's kind of different from that. This is just to train your imagination. We're looking for another solution, even though we already have one. You would never do this in a real game.
Okay.
Just for training purposes. So we know these moves are fine, but we're not playing them.
Okay.
We know we're not moving the king or the pawns.
Yeah.
And we know that they want to play this move. So imagine you get 2 moves in a row, but now the rook is on f6. Where would you want your rook to be to win the game? That's another way to think about this.
Oh, okay. Over here?
Well, if the rook is there, it can take you. You're really close, but like, think about it the other way. You do want to attack the king and the rook, but not rook first.
Okay.
This was your idea. Attack them on the line, but if you go on h6, you get taken.
than I thought it was. I mean,
It
the
might be.
only
It
other
might be.
legal. Okay, the other legal moves I have right now are these.
Yeah, it's just those.
Yeah. So then, this doesn't really make sense, does it?
Which one?
A2.
Why doesn't it? Like, let's say they play rook takes f6. What do you play after that?
Yeah.
I'm gonna get rid of the other ones just so that people who watch the recording can follow along. So we're thinking about rook a2.
Yeah.
And we know they're gonna play rook f6.
Uh-huh.
So what would you play after that to win the game?
Wait, would I not just take back?
What do you mean take back?
Or... No. Okay, so the rook taking my pawn hasn't happened yet, and I'm just looking for a move.
So our first move, you said rook a2 doesn't make sense, and I'm just challenging your notion that rook a2 doesn't make sense by saying, what if they just take the pawn? Right? That's the most challenging move for black.
Yeah.
Is there anything that could go wrong for black after they take that pawn? Supposing you played rook a2.
I guess not.
What's your move going to be then?
Rook a6.
All right, let's say they play king e7, protecting their rook.
Uh-huh.
Just using those tactical ideas we talked about. Look at the forcing moves first.
Oh, then it would be... Okay, yes. Then it would also be rook a7, and then... It's not an instant win.
Nope, I think it's not even a win. Because if you play rook a7, they could go back to the 8th rank, or they could play... Yeah, probably they would play like king f8 or something, and just keep trying to survive.
If the king is in, what, like e7 at the minute, then if I were to go to rook e7, or no, rook e2, then that's still not a win.
Well, you played rook a6 check first, right? And then king e7. Let's think about this in a more like endgame way. So, when one of the things that's good about endgames is once you know a few basic theoretical endgames, you can start searching for them in your variations.
Okay.
Now, one thing that we've seen a couple times in this example is that there's a winning king and pawn endgame, right? So, after rook takes f6, can we go to the pawn endgame and win? That's the kind of question that you start asking normally after you know a lot of endgames. Like, can I make this into something more reduced? It's like scientific reductionism, right? It's like the answer might be to make it simpler. So, what happens if you simplify? Let's pretend we play rook a2 and they take, and now we want to simplify. How do you do it?
Okay. Then you would just take their rook, and then they take you back, and then you take their pawn.
And that looks familiar.
Draw, maybe.
Well, hold on. Didn't we just look at this? Do you remember?
Ah, yeah.
What's the result here?
King can't go towards that area because he's blocked by the other king.
Right. This is called shouldering, by the way. Just to throw more terminology at you. When one king is blocking the other, and preventing it from following behind, that's shouldering. So, yeah, here they have to play just to look at something different from before. We looked at this move previously. You know, let's say they go here. I'm failing at clicking. There we go. Now, how do you win from this position? This is actually easier than when the king's in front.
King b5.
Yeah, that's right. We don't even have to go to a5 because they're not preventing us from taking the best square.
Okay.
All right, this is flexible. Just the pawn will follow behind. Okay, so this is a good thought experiment, right? Because you now know another way that you could play this position. You don't have to try to bring your king over and win the pawn. You could also just try to force them to trade rooks with this kind of move. I give this move an exclamation point just because it's kind of fancy. It's not strictly necessary. Okay, so black had to refuse to trade because if they play rook takes f6, they lose in a very simple way. And these are the kinds of luxuries that are afforded to you when you have a winning position. You can be very flexible, like almost always from a better position, you're going to reach a situation where you have several winning moves and they have to fight very hard to defend, if they even have a defense.
Okay.
So they played rook c7, and just show you the next couple of moves because the game ends right now. Rook a6. Okay. They played king d7 because if they trade rooks, they lose again. Right? Like, how do you win the game from here? Again, think in the endgame kind of way about how you can reduce the position.
Yeah, so I would take their rook
Okay.
with my rook.
And they take back?
Yeah.
And then?
F7.
Yeah, that's right.
And the king's already too far away to do anything about it.
Yeah. Do you remember the idea of the square from some of my videos? There's a square rule. If a pawn is promoting, you can easily check if the king can catch the pawn by seeing on their turn can they step into the square.
Okay.
In this case, it's not their turn, so they're outside the square, so you win. And this is trivial when the pawn's really close to promoting, but in a more complicated situation, this rule is actually pretty handy. Okay, just want to remind you that that exists. Anyway, so they have to play king d7. And what do you want to play here to win the game? They resigned on this move just because their position becomes totally hopeless.
Okay.
And that's the best part.
Yeah, I guess I would still continue with F7.
Okay, let's say we do it. I was actually just thinking about this move. This is not what they played in the game, but I think it might also win. They only have 2 reasonable moves, I think, to stop your pawn. So
Right.
what do you think it could be?
So one of them is King E7.
Yeah, and what's the other one? Just to show candidate moves.
Rook C8.
Right. Just because you said king e7 first, let's look at that one. Let's say we go here. How do we win the game? There's a very fancy move here.
Okay.
I like fancy. Usually I don't do fancy because like if you do fancy you'll mess up, but like during training it's nice to like train yourself to find the fancy moves.
When you're really gonna win, then you're like, okay, how can I make a stylish checkmate?
Yes, how can I possibly mess this up? Is another way to frame that question.
Yeah.
I once had a game where I'd made a big mistake and my opponent was showboating because he got a huge advantage. And so I just kept playing moves because, you know, I want to see what happens next. And he was like getting up from his seat and walking around and like seeing all of his games and pointing at my game and laughing and mocking me. And I'm just sitting there waiting. And so first he promotes to a queen. Then he promotes to a rook. Then he promotes to a bishop. Then he promotes to a knight, and it's stalemate. and then I got to showboat and point at his face and everything. Anyway, so it doesn't always pay to be fancy.
Yeah.
Anyway, but during training you can be as fancy as you want.
Okay. Oh, okay. Then I would go Rook E6.
Oh, you're so close. The problem with Rook E6 is that they can take your pawn.
Oh, right. Okay.
Right, but you're so close. That's a nice idea.
Rook F6 then?
Yeah, nice. So, see, once I say fancy, you know. If they take it, then you just make a queen, and that's really nice. Yeah. And so here they have to make a very sad defense on the back rank, and now you can win how you like. Maybe just take this one. Now they can't move their king, and they just have the same kind of problem playing a piece down.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is really nice. I like this idea to play f7. In the game, they played rook b6, just like, I'm going to pick off your b pawn, and that was enough to make the grandmaster resign. So, yeah, and the d pawn's also falling, so it makes a lot of sense. There's just no hope. Anyway, so I thought this was a really good example of the rook behind the pawn technique, and it applies in some specific endgames like this one. I'll just put the first position back so that can sink in. Yeah, so it applies in some positions like this, which you could regard as a theoretical rook endgame. It also applies often in the middle game. Sometimes the board just kind of clears out. You have a pass pawn now, so you just put your rooks behind those pass pawns and start pushing them, and oftentimes that's enough to win the game in pretty simple fashion. Another idea that we didn't get to see today, just for lack of time, that you should know about, is doubled rooks on the 7th rank. In the end game, in the opening, not in the opening, but like in the middle game, right? Pretty much any time, if you can double your rooks on the 7th rank, you get full control of the board with 2 pieces. And that's also really nice. It's a comparable advantage. Often it's even stronger. It's hard to accomplish, but it's stronger than like rook behind a pass pawn much of the time. Yeah, so these are just some favorable places to put your rooks relative to the pawns, and you can apply that in all of your games. It's pretty universal.
Nice.
Yes. Do you have any questions about this before we wrap up?
Ooh, okay, so what if you have a pawn on the 7th rank and your opponent has a pawn on the 2nd rank? Like, do you just both go for the queens?
That's a good question. So
Yeah.
your king would hopefully be able to stop their pawn while you are still promoting your pawn. A lot of the time, if we have a mutual promotion situation, it's going to be some kind of draw. Let me make an example. That is a good question. I'm just going to put the kings somewhere like far away from what matters. And I'll put the rook behind a passed pawn. And, we're just both doing that. All right, the position's about to appear. Okay, so let's say we have this. This is what you're talking about, right?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Like any variant of this situation where both pawns are going to promote anyway, and it's just a matter of who does it first.
Yeah, a lot of the time being first will help, but it's very case specific. Like promoting first with check might be good. Here, if you promote to a queen, I think that they can just take it, because when you take back, they make a queen and now they're winning. So you actually can't just go straight for it. The reason I think this often will result in a draw is you'll often have to go block their pawn, and that gives them a chance to try to win your pawn, like by bringing the king over.
Yeah.
And, like, one possible outcome for this particular very silly situation is like we just run over and there's nothing they can do to stop us from taking that pawn. So we just trade them all. Now a better situation would be one where your king is on like f1, because then you can promote with impunity. For example, if my king was on e2, I would not play d8. Well, actually I could play d8 queen because I'm already controlling the square. But if I was on like e3 with my king, I would play king e2 and then king f1 and then promote. Easy peasy.
So this is just something that you have to like think, I don't know, 2-3 moves.
Yeah, it's a calculation situation. You definitely need to look at some short variations and make sure you don't miss any candidate moves. Sometimes they'll add an in-between move where like you promote, but then they promote too, or they'll check and then they'll promote. You just have to look out for these kinds of clever moves in the middle, especially if there are more pieces on the board, because maybe the moment that you promote, they can go for an attack on your king, and then like it doesn't even matter that you promoted, or something similar. It's very case specific. Yeah, chess is a weird mix of like general and extremely specific, like prohibitively specific.
I mean, it seems like a lot of balance between like grabbing the best positions and then being like, okay, well, there's a free something, or like this is hanging, I can take it. Yeah.
That's why I recommend starting your examination of the position with something brute force, where you just look at the position, you see all the checks and captures and stuff, and if there's no interesting combination of those things from the get-go, then you start thinking strategically, because you never really want to miss those key moments where you're winning a piece or they're winning a piece. That's even worse, so you need to look for those first, and all the higher level thinking can wait if those things don't exist.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, so if you have any more questions, feel free to like message me later on, and you already have the worksheet for this week. So
Yeah.
all right, sounds good. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you.
Okay.